All right, so today we are going deep on LLMs for coding. We've got this really interesting blog post by Simon Willison. I mean, he's been using these things, LLMs for coding, for a couple years now. And, well, he's got some pretty cool insights to share. The question is it really as easy as it sounds? Everyone is saying, oh, LLMs, it's going to change everything.
Yeah, Willison starts off, though, by kind of reminding us we need to be a little bit realistic here. LMs are definitely powerful tools, no doubt about that. But it's not like they're just going to magically write, perfect code. You're not going to be able to just sit back and let the LLM do all the work.
Okay, so no robot overlords taking our jobs yet.
Okay.
But how should we be thinking about these LLMs? Like, what's a good way to understand how they work?
Wilson kind of describes them as fancy autocomplete, which I think is a good place to start. Basically, these LLMs, they're predicting the next token in a sequence. That could be a word, could be a symbol, a line of code, but there's more to it than just that, right?
Yeah, it's not just filling in the blanks. It's more nuanced than that. Wilson actually uses a pretty funny analogy. He calls LLMs an overconfident pair programming assistant.
Yeah, exactly. They can be super helpful, don't get me wrong, but they can also make some pretty bizarre mistakes that a human programmer would never make. Like they might suggest libraries that don't even exist or use syntax that is just totally wrong.
So it's like we got to keep them on a short leash. That being said, Willison talks a lot about context and how important that is when working with LLMs for coding. So what exactly does he mean by context, and why is it so important?
Right. He's talking about two kinds of context. One is the conversation history. So it's like you're having a back and forth with the LLM. It's remembering what you've already talked about. And that can influence how it responds to your prompts.
Okay, so it's like talking to someone who actually remembers what you said earlier instead of starting from scratch every time. That makes sense. But what about the other kind of context?
Yeah, the second kind, that's where things get really interesting. Think about giving the LLM access to your entire code base, or even like importing code from a repository on GitHub. Willison mentions Claude projects, and this tool is able to do that kind of stuff. And that gives the LLM a much deeper understanding of your project so it can generate more, relevant and accurate code.
So it's almost like giving your coding assistant a super detailed blueprint of what you're working on. Okay, so that's context. Now, another thing that Willison really emphasizes is the idea of training cutoff dates. Why are these dates so important?
Well, you got to remember, LLMs are trained on just massive amounts of data, but that data is frozen at a specific point in time. So, like he mentions, models like the ones from OpenAI, they're often trained on data up to a certain date,
Mhm.
which means they might not know about any libraries or updates that came out after that date.
Oh, so if I'm using some brand new, like bleeding edge library, the LLM might have no clue what I'm talking about.
Exactly. That's why Willison really recommends using libraries that are, pretty stable, popular, well documented. The more likely it is to be included in that training data, the more likely the LLM is going to understand how it works.
Right, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Now, Willison actually outlines two main ways that he uses LLMs when he's coding. He calls them the research phase and the authoritarian phase. Kind of
Mhm.
funny names. So can you walk us through what each of these phases is all about?
Yeah, sure. So the research phase, this is where you're using the LLM to, kind of explore your options, brainstorm solutions, and even build some quick prototypes. Think of it like the very beginning of a project, like you're just trying to figure things out. So you might ask the LLM for suggestions on like which libraries to use, maybe different ways to solve a particular problem, or even just to generate some code snippets just for like little specific tasks.
Oh, so it's like having a brainstorming partner that can like whip up code examples in real time.
Exactly. And Willison talks about how fun and how fast it is. Like you go from this kind of vague idea to a working prototype. He even gives a few examples of prompts that he uses, like asking for options for HTTP libraries in Rust or, how to implement a specific algorithm.
That's pretty cool. It seems like a really great way to get a project going, kind of get past that initial hurdle of figuring out where to start.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the research phase. Now, what about this authoritarian phase? It sounds a little bit, well, authoritarian.
Yeah, so in this phase, you're taking more of a directive approach. You're giving very specific instructions to the LLM, and you expect it to, follow them really closely. Willison kind of compares it to delegating work to like a highly skilled but slightly robotic intern. You're still the
Right.
architect, but the LLM's doing a lot of the heavy lifting.
And it's really interesting because in the blog post, Wilson actually gives this super detailed example. He shows how he gave the LLM a very specific Python function signature, including error handling, doc strings, and type annotations, and then he asked it to just write the code.
And the LLM totally nailed it. And it just shows you how powerful these LLMs can be for handling those kind of, tedious, repetitive tasks that, let's be honest, most developers just hate doing.
So it's like having this like super powered assistant who can take care of all the boring stuff while you focus on the big picture, the interesting parts. But there's a really important point that Willison makes here. Even though the LLM is generating the code, he is still in control. He is the one defining the function, the logic, the overall structure.
Absolutely. It's not about just abdicating responsibility to the LLM. It's more about using it as a tool to, like, translate your vision into code.
Yeah. Which brings us to another super important point, testing. Just because the LLM generated the code doesn't mean it's automatically bug-free.
Yeah, for sure. Willison emphasizes that you can't just trust the LLM's output blindly. You still need to test your code, make sure it's working as intended, because ultimately you are the one responsible for the final product.
And there's another cool thing that he mentions. Working with LLMs, it's really like a conversation. It's not just you give it one prompt and you're done. It's like you iterate, you refine, you tell it, write that better, until it finally gets it right.
Right. And the beauty of it is that you can be super honest with an LLM. Like, it doesn't have feelings, right? You can be as direct and critical as you need to be.
Now, things get even more interesting when Willison starts talking about tools that allow LLMs to actually run the code that they generate. He mentions ChatGPT Code Interpreter, Claude Artifacts, ChatGPT Canvas. So what is the big deal about these tools and like how do they fit into the whole picture?
So these tools, they're basically providing these, like, secure sandboxes where the LLM can execute code, can experiment with different approaches. It can even build, like, interactive applications, all without any risk of, messing up your actual system. It's pretty amazing.
Oh, so it's like a little virtual playground where you can let the LLM run wild and not worry about it, breaking something important.
Exactly. Although, Willison, he is very cautious about security. He definitely prefers tools that run the code in this sort of sandbox environment just to avoid any potential mishaps.
Right, of course. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about managing expectations, the importance of context, training cutoff dates, the research and authoritarian phases of using LLMs for coding, testing, and even tools that let LLMs run their own code. Whew. But then Willison drops this other really intriguing concept, vibe coding. What in the world is vibe coding?
So this is where we kind of let go of all those rigid structures and we just embrace a more experimental, kind of free-flowing approach to coding. Vibe coding is all about going with the flow, riffing off the LLM suggestions, and seeing where the creative journey takes you.
So it's less about having this like super detailed plan and more about letting the LLM kind of guide you.
Exactly. It's about embracing that back and forth, that iterative nature of working with LLMs and being open to being surprised by, what they're capable of. And honestly, Willison is like the king of vibe coding.
Yeah, in the post, he mentions this GitHub repository with over 80 HTML, JavaScript, and Python apps that he built entirely through LLM prompts. It's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's incredible. And he even built this colophon page for his website using Claude Code. He describes it in detail in the blog post. A really cool case study. He kind of walks you through how he used this iterative process to build something totally from scratch just by using the LLM.
Wait, hold on. He built a whole web page using LLMs. How long did that take him?
Less than 20 minutes, and it only cost him 61 cents. It's crazy how efficient it can be.
Okay, I'm intrigued. But I'm also like a little skeptical. How did he actually pull that off?
Well, he does describe the whole process in his blog post, but the main takeaway is that he had a clear vision of what he wanted to achieve, and he used the LLM as a tool to help him get there faster.
So it's not about the LM doing all the work. It's more about using it to like amplify your own skills and speed up the development process.
Exactly. And that speed, I mean, that can be a huge game changer, especially when you're working on smaller projects or you're just trying to, like, prototype an idea really quickly.
Okay, this is all really fascinating.
Yeah.
But even with all this automation and speed, there's a really key point that Willison makes. Sometimes you just have to be ready to take over yourself. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, so he actually ran into this himself when he was trying to automate the deployment of that colophon page, the one he built with Claude Code. He was using GitHub Actions, and the LLM generated the code, but it ended up causing some unexpected behavior.
Oh, so the LLM couldn't handle everything on its own.
Right. Wilson actually had to step in. He had to debug the issue, and ultimately he ended up completing the deployment manually.
So it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing. You still need to know what's going on under the hood, be prepared to troubleshoot when things go wrong.
Exactly. LLMs can do a lot, but they can't replace good old-fashioned human judgment and problem solving. You still need to have that deep understanding of how these systems actually work, especially when you're dealing with something as complex as GitHub Actions.
This is so insightful, and seems like what Willison is really advocating for is a more balanced approach, one where we're taking advantage of the power of LLMs, but we're also recognizing their limitations and, being ready to step in when needed.
Absolutely. It's about finding that sweet spot between automation and human expertise. Using LLMs to make our lives easier and to be more efficient, but not becoming overly reliant on them.
It's almost like the LLM gives you a head start, but you still need to know where the finish line is and how to get there.
That's a great way to put it. And it actually ties back to Willison's point about LLMs amplifying existing expertise. The more you know about coding, about different tools and technologies, the better you can actually use LLMs. They become more like an extension of your skill set, not a replacement for it.
So it's not about LLMs making coding easy. It's more about making it faster and more efficient so you can focus on the more creative and strategic aspects of development.
Exactly. And that speed, I mean, that's huge. Like Willison, he built a finished deployed feature in under half an hour. Think about how much time that could save you on a bigger project.
That's pretty amazing. Okay, I think we need to pause here and we'll come back in part 2 to talk a little bit more about this whole fascinating approach to LLM-powered coding.
And it's not even just about the time saving. It's also it opens up so many new possibilities. Willison talks about how using LLMs has actually made him a lot more ambitious with his projects.
Yeah.
He's willing to tackle things now that he just wouldn't have even considered before because, the development process is so much faster.
Yeah, it's almost like LLMs have kind of lowered the barrier to entry a little bit. It's easier to experiment, to try new things because you're not so worried about sinking weeks into something that might not even work out.
Exactly. That's the really powerful thing here. It's not just about automating tasks. It's about kind of expanding the scope of what's even possible, using LLMs as the springboard for, innovation and creativity.
Okay, so let's try to sum up our deep dives into Simon Willison's blog posts.
Yeah.
What are the key takeaways? If someone is interested in using LLMs for coding, what should they really remember?
Okay, well, first and foremost, I think, is manage those expectations. LLMs are amazing, they're fantastic tools, but they're not a magic solution.
Right.
They're not going to solve every problem. They're here to augment your skills, not to replace them.
Right. It's not about becoming an LLM whisperer and forgetting how to code altogether.
Yeah.
It's about finding that, that balance.
Exactly. The second takeaway, I think, is context is king. The more information you can feed into an LLM, the better it's going to perform. That could be conversation history, it could be code snippets, it could even be access to your entire code base. Context is key.
So it's before you set the LLM loose on your project, you got to give it a crash course in what you're working on. The more it understands, the more helpful it can be.
For sure. And then the third thing, I think, is to really embrace that iterative nature of working with LLMs. It's a conversation. It's a back and forth process of refining and experimenting. Don't be afraid to, tell it to write that better or even to just start over completely if things aren't working the way you want.
It's a partnership, not a dictatorship. You're working with the LLM to achieve a goal.
Exactly. The fourth thing to remember, don't forget about those training cutoff dates. If you're working with super cutting-edge stuff, the LLM might just not be up to speed. Stick to stable, well-documented libraries whenever possible.
It's almost like checking the expiration date on a carton of milk.
Yeah.
Or you want to make sure the LLM is using fresh knowledge.
Right, exactly. And then the final takeaway, I think, is be prepared to take over if you need to. LLMs are great at following instructions, but they can't replace human intuition and problem-solving skills. You're still the captain of the ship. The LLM is just a very capable first mate.
I love that analogy. I think that really captures the essence of this whole collaborative approach to coding with LLMs. So out of all of this, what really stands out to you about Willison's approach? Does it change how you think about LLMs and coding?
Honestly, I think the thing that strikes me most is his pragmatism. He's not getting swept up in all the hype. He acknowledges both the strengths and the limitations of LLMs, and he's using them in a way that complements his existing skills and workflow.
Yeah, it's really refreshing to see someone who is so grounded in reality, but is still so excited about all the potential. He's not afraid to experiment and kind of push those boundaries, but he's also aware of the potential pitfalls.
And you can just tell he's having fun with it. There's this real sense of joy and discovery in his writing.
It's contagious. Like, it makes you want to just dive in and start experimenting yourself.
Yeah, for sure. So to all our listeners, if you're curious about LLMs and how they can like change the way you code, definitely go check out Simon Willison's blog post. It's full of insights and really practical advice.
And don't forget, it's not about replacing human developers with AI. It's about finding ways to work together to build cool things.
Yeah, so to wrap things up, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with today?
Well, I think the big thing is that LLMs are powerful, but they're just a tool.
Hmm.
The real magic comes from combining human ingenuity and creativity with that computational power.
Yeah, it's a really cool partnership, and it's just the beginning. We're still in the early stages of this technology, but it's clear that LLMs have the potential to really like revolutionize how we code.
And the developers who are going to shape the future, they're the ones who embrace this change, who are willing to experiment and push the boundaries.
That's so true. Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
We covered so much today, but hopefully this deep dive has given everyone listening a much better understanding of how LLMs are changing the world of coding, and maybe even inspired them to give it a try themselves.
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting time to be a developer, right? So many possibilities. And we're really just scratching the surface of what we can do with these LLMs.
I know, it feels like we're like right on the edge of this major shift in how we think about software development.
Mhm.
Like, it's the Wild West out there. New tools and techniques popping up all the time.
And you know what's really cool? You don't need to be like a coding genius to get started with this stuff. Willison makes it pretty clear in the blog post. Anyone with a little curiosity, willing to experiment, they can really start using these LLMs.
That's a great point. It's not just for the, elite programmers. It's a tool that can be used by anyone who wants to create something.
Exactly. And that's what's so revolutionary about all of this. It's kind of democratizing software development,
Mm.
making it more accessible.
So to all our listeners out there, we say, don't be intimidated by the hype. Just dive in, experiment, see what these amazing tools can do for you.
You might be surprised by what you discover. You might find that you're more capable than you thought. You might even build the next killer app. Who knows?
And remember, even though these LLMs are powerful, human expertise, critical thinking, those things are still so important. It's really the combination of human ingenuity and AI that will truly shape the future of software.
Absolutely. It's a partnership, not a replacement. And it's a partnership that I think has huge potential.
I think that's a great point to end on. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Simon Wilson's blog post, but hopefully it's been insightful and maybe even a little inspiring.
Yeah, and who knows? Maybe this is just the start of your journey into the world of LLM-powered coding.
Until next time, happy coding, everyone.